and whether democracy is why we have resilience. I am asking that question because before we did the democracy project in the 1990s, we never talked about resilience. But it appears like we are talking about it now. Is it because of democratic experiments that we have in the continent? And by resilience, we mean that ability of states and communities to anticipate, forestall, and absorb shock without changing form. That is our definition of resilience. And the question we are asking here is whether democracy is what has precipitated shock, and hence the need for resilience. Second question I'm going to pose, set of questions I'm going to pose, is whether democracy is created or found. And this is a question that is posed by a scholar known as von Hayek on the rule of law, where he asks whether a law is found or is created. In fact, he believes that the rule of law is not what the law is, but that the rule of law is what the law ought to be. And the question here is whether democracy is a product of a spontaneous order, that is sustainable democracy for that matter. Is it a product of a spontaneous order, or is it a product of an order in design? Do you find it or do you create it for it to become sustainable? And these are the questions that were posed in the 18th century by proponents and people. It was the protagonists and antagonists of the theory of liberty. One group was known as the evolutionists, and they were more concerned with liberty, not democracy. Prof. Okuthe, you don't agree. But they were more interested in liberty and not democracy, whereas the rationalists were more interested in democracy and not liberty. I want to put it to this meeting that in Africa, we are more about democracy and not liberty. Now, liberty is the granting of opportunities and the burden of choice. That's how liberty is defined by von Hayek. And the main argument there is that there's a whole spectrum of liberty. And within this particular spectrum, you can locate whatever kind of state you want to locate. On one end, you can have liberal democracy and a state that is governed by that. And on the other extreme of liberty, you can have what they call the night watchman state. The night watchman state is essentially Hobbesian in the sense that it is supposed to take care of you only at night. So the state is constituted simply to protect you and your property, although the property argument was developed later by Locke. So the question here is whether democracy in Africa should be viewed from the evolutionist perspective, or whether we should view it from the rationalist perspective. Is it something that we should view as something that is created and then given to us, or is this something that's supposed to evolve? And if it evolves, then it provides for more a broader spectrum of liberties. And the argument of the evolutionists here was actually that you need to constantly negotiate consent. That, and let me clarify this, that if you find democracy through a spontaneous order, the spontaneous order is not necessarily an order that is chaotic, but the spontaneous order is actually a self-regulating order, an order in which you are constantly negotiating consent, and an order in which the more consent gained, the more legitimate the state is said to be. But the rationalist, providing an alternative perspective, in their view, democracy was a utopia that you create for people to aspire for. And I want to submit to you that that utopia is what was brought to the Africans, and we actually swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And as a result of that, this part of the world is politically constipated as a result of swallowing half-baked notions that are basically utopian. I'm posing that as my conceptual thinking, and in proposing the consociational model of democracy, I want to propose to you that democracy is only sustainable so long as it is found. If you create it, it will not be sustainable. Historically, can you do the second slide, the next slide? Historically, as Africans, the state in Africa was constructed through the notion of Cecil Rhodes, and I have made this submission in the past. When Cecil Rhodes conceived the highway from Cape Town to Cairo, let me put on how do you switch this on? Philip? How is it? When Cecil Rhodes conceived the highway from Cape Town to Cairo, that was the original design of the African state. And that state was designed simply to do extraction, to facilitate the extraction of resources from the hinterlands to the waterways. And you realize that even today, the state is still extractionist. And that is because in its DNA, it was constructed to do extraction. The state in Eastern Africa, in particular, was constructed as a company, the Imperial British East Africa Company, and then inherited almost completely intact with all its distortions by the African nationalists. And when you talk about corruption, I'm not surprised that the African state is corrupt. It's because in its DNA it was constructed to be corrupt. Professor Kuthi and I have had arguments whether the African state was in the first place created. Does it exist? And if it was not created, does not exist, how can it be said to have failed or to be experiencing fragility or fractures? Now, if this is the way we constructed the state in Africa, and we allowed this construction that was a distortion to brood for 30 years, and within this we had dictatorships emerging, and we had all manner of things, including military rule. 30 years down the road, the global south came and they plastered on this condition, on this distortion. They plastered something they called liberal democracy. And in my view, this was the original sin. If we're having challenges in the democratic experiment in this part of the world, the original sin was in the construction of the African state. A construction as extractionist, construction as an elite project, but also construction out of the thinking of the rationalists. I know Steve Ouma will not agree with me on that, but I will put it to you, and then you can give me your thinking, because I know you'll be my discussant. Now, what happened is that when we plastered the liberal democratic model on this distortion, we came to a situation of the post-developmentalist state. And the developmentalist state was actually a state whose politics was rationalized using development. That if you gave development to the people, then you became legitimate. Now, post-developmentalist is a state in which development is not as important. Before, Nyerere used to tell us that democracy must come in small installments behind development. But then the post-developmentalist state reversed that and say that you cannot have development unless you have an environment that is democratic. Now, there are 5 or 6 things that resulted from this. One was a transition from economic conditionality to political conditionality, and this, I think, was a forced transition. You do recall the conversations in the 1980s where Elliot Budge was hired by the World Bank to tell the bank why African economies are not happening. And Budge produced a report that was known as the Budge Report. And in that report, he said that the problem with Africa are the structures. And so he came up with structural adjustment programs to deal with those particular structures. But what was interesting is that he identified politics as a main problem with these structures. But the solutions that he preferred were not political, they were economic, until 10 years later. But there were arguments also that were offered by the Africans, and probably this was the end of the African discourse. You do remember the Monrovia strategy that was later taken up by the Lagos Plan of Action of 1981, and the final Act of Lagos. All of these were blueprints for the African economic crisis, or to get out of it. And the United Nations Economic Commission, led by Professor Adebayo Adedeji, was at the forefront here. But when we abandoned the argument, when the African submitted to the thinking of the bank, 10 years down the road after Budge, they introduced political conditionality. In the case of Kenya, because I'm familiar with this, part of my PhD work was around this. What actually happened was that Arap Moi had no intentions of, when he went for the Paris, remember the Paris Club meetings that used to happen, where Africans would go to negotiate for funds. When Arap Moi showed up there, the Paris meeting had no intentions of forcing him to go democratic. But he immediately announced to them that we have decided to go multi-party. That was in March 1991. And the idea there was for him to transact with the bank. And I want to submit to you then that democracy in Africa was created as a transactional a process where you agreed to become democratic in order to get aid. That actually is what happened in this part of the world when we introduced political conditionality. But another feature, and here I will want to get a response from my brothers, Dr. Sewanyana from Uganda and Dr. Ouma, and maybe also Professor Kagwanja, because these are sectors that you have worked in. One of the things that happened was that the donor was beginning to lose relevance at some point, and they were beginning to lose sway. And so they had to create what we call the democracy and governance sector of civil society as a way of creating voice for themselves. And that particular sector became the alternative state. Steve, I want to put it to you that you are the alternative state. The only problem with that is that that sector has not been completely anchored in the popular positions of our people. And that is the reason why we had a third development, which are called green movements or green formations. Green formations emerged as part of the invisible sector of civil society. And green formations are not green in the sense of environmental, but they are green in the sense that they began working with land issues and issues of secure tenure. You're very familiar with this particular issue. And the problem with, or what happened is that it began to emerge as an alternative voice to the captured voices of the DG sector. And this is to be found in Uganda, it's to be found in most of the African countries, except that in some of the countries that we have studied, these green formations became illiberal, and that's how militia proliferation in most of our region began. They began as green formations. For instance, Mungiki, which is a militia group, was a militia group here in Kenya. Professor Kagwanja, you're very familiar with it. Mungiki, did you know that the leader of Mungiki was actually incubated at the Kenya Human Rights Commission? He was an intern there. And he began well as a green formation, as part of the invisible sector of civil society, but then degenerated into this situation of being illiberal. But that was one result of the post-developmentalist state. The other one was the rise of strong nations versus weak states. This is a position taken by Hannah Arendt in her book on the origins of totalitarianism. And the idea here is that the state is supposed to be the convener of the nation. And when the state is weak, the nation takes over. And by nation, I mean the mosaic or the fractures or the multiplicity of nationalities that constitute our countries. In Kenya, we have had 42 nationalities, or 42 nations. Some people call them tribes. Now we have added another 2. We have 44 nations. But in a situation where the state is weak, then the nation takes over. And if there has been ethnicization of politics, it's been because of the weakening of a state, in my view. But this was a product of the post-developmentalist state. Then there was a rise of constitutions without constitutionalism. This is a concept developed by Professor Okoth Ogendo, where we were forced to have constitutions and to revise constitutions, some of which were not very bad anyway. And we adopted new constitutions, but we did not order our politics using these constitutions. And this is exactly what our situation has been. But lastly, there was the emergence of what we call boundary conditions that were artificial. Now, boundary conditions is a concept used in engineering and mathematics. It's a concept about the minimum and the maximum values that you factor into a situation before you take an option. And in our case, the boundary conditions included constitutional change and a two-term presidency, and there are quite a number of other things that came in with these particular conditions. Next slide. I'll come back to boundary conditions in a bit. Now, what happened, in my view, is that the result of all these things, constitutions that we were forced to adopt without constitutionalism, the nation becoming stronger than the state, and all that, we developed what I call a double bind. And the double bind is a situation in which you're damned if you do, damned if you're not. So if you are Yoweri Museveni, if you run for election, you will lose. If you don't run for elections, you will lose. Either way, you will lose. If you are Raila Odinga in the case of Kenya, if you run for elections, you will lose. If you don't run for elections, you will lose. If you boycott elections as he did, you will lose. Either way, you will lose. It becomes a zero-sum situation. It is a double bind. And the double bind was experienced in Uganda. It was experienced in Rwanda, DR Congo, South Sudan, and Professor Wasara, I'll want you to correct me on this one, and even Ethiopia. They all experienced this double bind. And the result of that particular experience was the rise of what I call Praetorian Democracy. The word Praetorian borrows from the Greek concept of the Praetorian Guard. And the Praetorian Guard was seen as a custodian of the will of the people. And in some instances, it was said to take over from the king, or whoever it was, the emperor, in the interest of the people. And the military in Africa was known to be exactly that. It was seen to be as a custodian of our constitutions, custodian of our political and democratic order, so that when we go against the order, then the guard moves in. But what happened in the case of Uganda, DR, South Sudan, and Rwanda, Mutebi, you'll correct me on this one when you speak as well, was that there were no options except to go Praetorian. But then the idea of military coups was impossible those days. That is around the 1990s, 1986 for Museveni. And so what they had to do was to concoct some 10-man armies and go into the forest and come into the capital cities to take over power. And that's what Kagame did. And then after doing that, you basically constitutionalize the new order that you have brought into place. So either way, you have managed to create a democratic order, but the path of doing it was not necessarily a liberal path. It was not through competition, it was not through elections. but it was through the Praetorian, or what you'd want to call the Neo-Praetorian direction. But there is another thing here, because this is the politics of exit. You know, the whole notion of exit and voice, it's a concept in political science that you either express yourself or you exit and you constitute a new order using external means. The exit option also experienced, at least in the case of some of these countries, it experienced a number of reversals, but we will interrogate them whether they are reversals or not. In fact, Burundi right now is going through a reversal. I think the referendum has happened, and Nkurunziza is supposed to be in power. I don't know, and it's a tentative hypothetical position. But I'm beginning to ask myself the question, what is wrong with that? I know Sewanyana will be violent about this as a human rights person, and Steve Omer, but I mean, these are boundary conditions that were given to us, and we swallowed them completely, but now it appears like they're not working. So we are experiencing this set of reversals. Lastly, there one other path, and this is a path that I want to propose to you, the consociational path. And I want to suggest to you that power should not be negotiated through competition only. It can actually be negotiated through dialogue. That it should not be a zero-sum game, it can be a positive-sum game. That actually countries that have experienced the consociational model, which is a model of inclusion, is a model that begins first and foremost with elite consensus, or the consensus of nationalities, because the model, as was designed by David Apter, foremost political scientist, and later developed by Aaron Liffert. The model advances from a situation where you take a country and truncate it into sectors, or into nations in the case of our countries, 44 nations in Kenya, and so on. And once you do the truncation, you do pre-election negotiations in which you agree who will get what. And then you go into election. So it is a combination of competition and dialogue. And I want to propose to you that maybe the consociational model is a model that Africans should consider, especially in this particular region. And when we talk about boundary conditions and talk about elasticity, this is how we define it. We define elasticity as a maneuvering between the minimum and the maximum values that I talked about. Let me explain that again. That the boundary conditions that if we are going to be in a state of constant negotiation, a state in which consent is constantly revised and constantly negotiated, because that is what I'm proposing to constitute in liberty. If you're going to be in that state, then there has to be some conditions that are normative. And by normative, I mean they do not have to be written. They will be developed using conventions, norms, and patterns. And these conditions will have a minimum and they will have a maximum value. And elasticity is the fluctuation, is a dance between the maximum and the minimum value. In my view, if democracy in this part of the continent is not made elastic, if it is not negotiated in this normative realm, because Africans have a tendency of having legislation on everything. In this country, we have even legislated on marriage, on things that do not require legislation. And that's the reason why our constitutions are too long. The Constitution of the Americans is how many? Is it 7 articles or something? The Norwegian Constitution, I think, is 2 pages or something like that. Our Constitution in Kenya here is about 300 pages. We have constitutionalized everything, including relationships. And the more we do that, the more we move away from the normative, from this particular space of a maximum and a minimum where we can have negotiations. And so my submission to you is that if we do not create this particular space where democracy can be elastic, the Praetorian model of democracy will become the dominant model in this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. I guess it's still morning. Good morning to everyone. I'm really honored to have been invited here, and I really want to express my gratitude to the Hub and the entire fraternity for this very good opportunity. It's always a pleasure to listen to my good friend, Professor Mtahi. We go a long way. We have been in the trenches for quite some time. And definitely the idea of reflection and creative thinking has always been part and parcel of his menu. And I'm glad that it has come to pass. So this meeting, to me, is a welcome opportunity. Before I talk about the elasticity of democracy in the Republic of Uganda, let me say something about the mandate that I hold, because it's a requirement for me to popularize the mandate. My UN mandate is a mouthful. It's the UN Independent Expert on Promoting a Democratic and Equitable International Order. It's a global mandate. I'm required by virtue of that mandate to examine country practices on democracy, governance, respect for human rights, and also practices on equity, and propose recommendations to the world body. I'm required to interrogate best practices in this area and bring them to the attention of the world body. I am required to carry out consultations at national, regional, intergovernmental levels with a view of identifying obstacles and best practices in governance, democracy, respect for human rights, and rule of law. I am required to report to the UN Human Rights Council every year. My first report is due in September, and the UN General Assembly every year. My first report is in October. I'm supposed to interface and interrogate current practices in this field among member states, but also among multilateral institutions, such as the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. I'm supposed to interface with regional bodies, like the African Union, the European Union, the Organization of American States, as well as any other relevant fora, and bring the lessons and experiences to the global bodies. So it's a very ambitious mandate created by UN Council Resolution 18.6 and further elaborated 36.4. So in this sort of meeting, I really want to learn as much as possible. That's why I'm really grateful to the Hub for having invited me. Whatever you discuss here is of great value to the mandate that I hold. So you can see how beneficial this meeting is to me. And as I said at the introductory stage, this is my very first meeting, and I hope to draw lessons from this meeting and bring them to life in my first report that is due in September in Geneva. Now, having said that, I now want to touch the subject of the elasticity of democracy in the Republic of Uganda. I want to say that I really agree with my brother Mutahi about the state construct. In my view, it's a very artificial creation. In my view, democracy itself should be a value. It is not about the philosophies, structures, and so. It must be something one feels, one revers, one appreciates, because at the bottom of it is about participation. My understanding of democracy is about participation, that people's views matter, that whatever decisions you make, they are part and parcel of the decision-making process, and that the outcome is owned. When that does not happen, then democracy, I think, becomes a foregone conclusion. So ideally, I agree with him that whatever experiments we have had, they do not actually, they are not successful, mainly because we have not been able to breed that value on the continent. Where perhaps I may disagree with my brother Mutahi that we have had democratic reversals. In my view, my brother Mutahi, we have not had any democracy, so there is nothing to reverse. So in my view, I don't see any reversals because it has never been part and parcel of the African state. But in all other arguments, I think I follow your path. As I continue, let me now look at Uganda. When we talk about elasticity of anything, I think, my dear friends, you are talking about the potential to expand or to shrink. The potential to expand or to shrink. But in the first place, whatever shrinks or expands must exist. So does it exist to expand and shrink? That is my question. Now I move to Uganda. And of course, in looking at Uganda, I am just going to, in many ways, just simply illustrate what my brother Mutahi has said, how it applies squarely to Uganda. At break tea, one of the participants from Addis Ababa, I think she's from IGAD, contested the fact that I called Uganda the Pearl of Africa. So she wanted me to say, in what way is Uganda the Pearl of Africa? And I was telling her beautiful climate, nice weather, nice people. And then she says, oh, that seems to resonate across the continent. But that was the description given to Uganda by Winston Churchill after visiting it. Maybe it's time to contest that, but I still hold, I hope, Mr. Glover, you agree with that we are the Pearl of Africa in all respects, for all intents and purposes. Now, for me, I've chosen to take in my write-up, which is, I think, well contained in the manuscript we have been given, a historic perspective. And by using a historic perspective, I'm just going to run you through the series of events as they have unfolded in Uganda and the way I understand them, and how the democratic experience or democracy experience has been a complete failure. Now, my starting point also is democracy in itself is a contested notion. There has been so much writing about democracy. But much as it is a contested notion, I want to submit that our current thinking is that democracy is a universal value. I want to agree with Nobel Peace Prize laureate Amartya Sen when he said that democracy is a universal value. And I also want to agree in every way that with Lyle Diamond, who has done a lot of work at the University of Stanford, that indeed there is nothing better than democracy that the world can ever experience, if it exists. Countries that have democratic practices enjoy greater freedom, they enjoy greater development, they are more stable, and I think I want to agree with the Lale Diamond. But having said that, I want to submit that in line with my brother Mutahi, what he calls constitutional democracy, I want to call it participatory democracy. There are many theories of democracy, but for me, there are three forms of democracy one needs to interrogate. One is what you call, of course, liberal democracy, which we have tried to practice in this region. Of course, it overlaps with electoral democracy, but then increasingly, I want to submit that what he calls constitutional democracy, for me, I call it participatory democracy. Because at the bottom, or at the very center of any democratic experiment, is the whole question of participation and contestation. So where the two values exist, participation and contestation, then definitely you have democracy. That's why my view of democracy, as Petman, Lively, Jack have said, is participatory democracy. So, looking at Uganda, have we had any case of democracy at all? Without going into the arguments. Now let's look at democracy in Uganda. My starting point, again, thinking about the neighboring Republic of Uganda, is that this is a country that has never had any democratic tradition. There are no elements of democratic tradition in our political architecture. If you look at the pre-colonial society, because I'm using a historic perspective, look at the pre-colonial society. When you look at the pre-colonial society in Africa, who was supreme? The king was supreme in Uganda. Whether you look at Buganda, whether you look at Ankole, whether you look at Busoga, whether you look at, they were supreme. Their word was the law. And they never tolerated any form of dissent. If you ever dissented, the best thing was either to be exiled, killed, whatever. There was no form of, there was no parity. The only people they listened to were their councils. And even those, they had minimum form of dissent. Even today, with the reintroduction of kingdoms in Uganda, among the Baganda, Mutahi and my brothers know, when the king arrives, we all submit. We even fall on the ground. And that is common for all all the kingdoms in Uganda. So there was that element, that mystery that was created. There is that mystery. There is, there is fear. Royalty in itself, it breeds fear. You need, and respect, and then society was stratified. We had the royals and the peasants, and that's very common in all our kingdoms in Uganda. The royals, those are the more cherished ones, and then the common peasants, you were right from the beginning, either you were born to be a royal or you were born to be a peasant. Isn't it, Mr. Kulova, in our say? And you have to follow that line, And as such, I do not see any democratic, elements. But perhaps you could say, for example, among the Baganda, there was some element of participation, limited participation. But talk about Ankole, talk about Bunyoro, my goodness, they never, the king of Ankole or the king of Bunyoro never tolerated any form of dissent. There are these people, they call them Abarusura. The guards, man, they were really terrible. They exercised a lot of power over the other people. So if you could look at the pre-colonial leadership, I put it to you that was both paternalistic and authoritarian. There was nothing to talk about in terms of real democracy in the way my brother has described it. Leadership in pre-colonial society in Uganda was largely based on myths, tradition, customs, and rituals. And if you interrogate those customs, myths, and tradition, you'll be shocked by the extent of subjugation that those myths actually brought. So in my starting point, I do not see any element of serious democracy, both normative in practice in pre-colonial Africa. But of course I can say maybe you may look at other societies, but Uganda, maybe in Ghana, I have not interrogated Ghana as such, but look at the Zulus. I mean, the level of subjugation is intolerable. I mean, it was all about war, it's about defeat and sharing loot. If you had loot, you shared, and all that. But again, maybe I'm too strict on my society, but that's how I look at it. Okay, let's move forward. We come to the colonial period. Now, the colonial period really took advantage of the patrimonial system of governance that existed. When the British came to Uganda and they found all these kingdoms and they saw the power that the kingdoms had over their subject, they took advantage of that. You look at Buganda, for example, they introduced the indirect rule, the system of chiefs. And the chiefs were not accountable to anyone. They were not elected. They were simply appointed. And of course, their role was to protect the interests of the colonial power. So when you look at it, definitely, when we come to this whole question, you find that increasingly the colonial regime had no checks and balances. It was largely based on authoritarian rule. It was a system of exploitation. And indirect rule in itself, replicated that element of patrimonial governance that was synonymous with the African governance architecture. Okay, so what happened? Of course, at the dawn of independence, I think what we see in Uganda and many British Africa was the opening of spaces. There was now an attempt to open spaces as the dawn of independence came in. You saw what actually happened because, there was that feeling that, we need to leave behind maybe a system that can work. But as Anyanyong has said, it was too little, too late. There were no elements of democracy during colonial rule. It was difficult to understand how some of these systems work. So when we negotiated our constitution at the turn of independence in 1962, the so-called Lancaster Conference Constitution. There was, an effort to, bring in checks and balances. A Bill of Rights was introduced in the Constitution. We have a legislature, we have the executive. On the other hand, we have the judiciary. But because there was no respect, there was no value system which we are talking about. It didn't exist. The post-colonial leaders did not really appreciate this constitution. No wonder that immediately after we got independence, the post-colonial governments, they suspended these constitutions. Look at Kenya, look at Tanzania, look at many of these British African countries. They suspended this constitution which provided for checks and balances. And they introduced what is called the communitarian ideology. Now, the communitarian ideology, I think all of us know, it was about community over in the individual. So the individual interest did not matter. The individual claim did not matter. As Nyerere puts it, they introduced what is called African popular democracy, the African democracy. What was democratic about the African leadership during the post-colonial period? For me, it was basically subjugation. They brought Ujama. Up to today, if you go to Tanzania, they cherish Nyerere here, Nyerere there, Nyerere here, Nyerere. And that's what Museveni also wants. Museveni here, Museveni there, Moi here, Moi there, Moi here. Kamuzubanda here, Kamuzubanda there, Kamuzubanda here, Kamuzubanda there. It was all about personal rule. When I look at their governance, it was about personal rule. So for me, I don't agree with anyone who says we had democracy after post-colonial. What democracy existed? There was nothing. And perhaps the root of the problem is this. In the struggle for independence, that is my thinking and from what I've read, the struggle for independence was not about struggle for democracy. No, it was about power. These guys wanted power. No wonder when they attained the power, the first people they imprisoned were their colleagues with whom they had actually enjoyed that degree of freedom and associational space that had been ushered in immediately. We got independence. So the first victims were their friends. If Mutahi was my friend and we had worked together to struggle for independence and we knew what the right to organize was and freedom of expression, now the only way of dealing with Mutahi was not to promote him but to ban him and to imprison him. I see that everywhere. So if they understood what democracy means and respect for human rights, why is it that we see a lot of banning, detention, and so on immediately after independence? So when you think about the one-party state idea that came in after independence, it was about entrenching oneself, ensure that I'm in control, no room for dissent. For me, that's what I see. And increasingly, that seems to be the phenomena that seems to have, characterized us all the way. But I must submit that at the dawn of independence, there was some element of freedom. If you look at the independence struggles, if you see everywhere, even if you go to DRC, if you go to Ghana, people really enjoyed some degree of dissent and there were rallies, people spoke. In my country, Uganda, Ignatius Musazi, they had rallies everywhere. There was that new freedom that was established. But after that, the guys now took control. They had power. And now the result was what? The economies were characterized then by corruption and, of course, patronage, and the economies did collapse. And that's what brings in, of course, the Bretton Woods institutions, my brother Mutahi, as a way of sustaining their economies, as a way of remaining in power. They had to go to the West and say, please, please, our economies are collapsing, our people are going to rise against us, so why don't you inject some money? And I think, Mutahi, you are right. They told them the only form of governance we know here is democracy. Allow people to express themselves, allow them to associate, and I think that brings in the new alternative state, which Mutahi talks about, the new alternative state. And now it was the donor imposing conditionalities. It was the donor telling these people that they must practice democracy and human rights. And now it was time for them to say, okay, let's allow some of these, let's allow NGOs to exist. But did they understand what these alternatives were? No, they did not understand. No wonder when you look at the pattern ever since that time, what you see is a closure of space, the erosion of civic space, because they never believed in it. It was part and parcel of the new game. The new game was, if I'm to get money, I must open up. And opening up meant, okay, few NGOs, associations, and so on, and as such, it's not about the belief. There was no belief in that. There's no tradition. And as such, this whole thing of egalitarianism, you know, the Africans preach, I want you to interrogate. By the way, one of the issues I'm supposed to deal with under my mandate is to propose themes for further study for democratic development around the world. Help me also to understand this concept of egalitarianism. What is egalitarianism? Because this egalitarianism, if you think seriously about it, is about me and the other. It's about me having an upper hand under the guise that we are all equal, we are all African brothers and sisters. What is that you are talking about? Please help me in your study to interrogate the subject of egalitarianism. But let's move very fast because I'm sure the chair may not give me a lot of time. So let's move. Now here we are. We have the post-independence governments. I have explained what they do and how they behaved. And in Uganda, if you read my paper, you will find, Obote comes in, finds this constitution, suspends it. He says, I moved to the left. Before long, there's so much corruption. The center cannot hold. Idi Amin takes advantage of that. He stages a coup. He takes over power. We have military rule. Under militarism, of course, you know what happened. We're under a lot of oppression, killings of so many people were killed, a lot were detained, and it took a combined effort of Nyerere with his forces and the Liberation Front to throw him out. There was so much conflict. A lot of blood was shed, and then came in the short governments. When they came in, they were now again thinking, how do we also entrench ourselves? The short governments, when you study them, they had real problems until it became clear that maybe we need again to go back to democracy. So, if you look after the overthrow of Idi Amin in 1979 and the subsequent government, and of course Obote coming back, then we had again elections. We had elections in 1980. Very interestingly. Now, talk about the elections. In 1980, the elections were very interesting. I was a very young boy. I remember very well that I had a lot of hope in those elections. I woke up very early in the morning. I went to cast my vote. And I want to tell you one thing. Ugandans voted overwhelmingly in 1980. They thought there was a new hope. And what happens? After the elections, when we were expecting results, the chairman of the military commission came out. There was an announcement. The military commission, Chairman Paulo Mwanga. Anyone who dares to announce the results, even to celebrate, will of course have a fine or imprisonment of 5 years or so. My goodness, was that democracy at work? And all Ugandans were subdued. The tanks took over, and you could see fear. And what did we see? He rigged the elections in favor of Obote. Obote comes back. The second regime of Obote was a reign of terror. He was never in control. Multipartyism was a joke. Everywhere was terror. There was fear. Everything broke down. Now the Ugandans who had hoped that a new era had come, They were all subdued once again. They were all subjugated. I have never seen so much horror. I've never seen so much blood. I've never seen so much subjugation. And there we are. And then what happens? Museveni, who was part and parcel of the short government, who had been part of the history of Uganda, took advantage of that. And then he said, I have gone to the bush. You go to the bush, he got one vote. He had participated in the election. His party had not been rigged. It was the Democratic Party that had been rigged. He uses the advantage. He builds a personal army. He goes to the bush and comes back in 1986. And I come from a region that was battered with conflict, the Luwero Triangle, where the real war took place. My father died during that war. Many of our people died, thinking that there was hope. So Museveni comes back, and what does he do? Like Idi Amin did. He issues legal notice number 1 of 1986, taking over government. And he says, I have a 10-point program. And the first thing, restore democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. And everyone thinks, oh, there is hope. Blood has been shed, democracy is back, and we have hope. What was the first thing he did under the legal notice number 1? He banned political parties. No political parties here. So the idea of participation and contestation, no. Which is the core of democracy. Nothing to do with that. I have introduced local councils. Local councils, yes, they have judicial and administrative power. No element of choice, no element, as Mamdani puts it, no element of representation. It's more of a decision based on his ideology. And shortly thereafter, he introduces the NRC. Was it elected? I dare say I know. He also introduces what are called interest groups in parliament, the women, the youth, the army, not knowing that what he was actually introducing was an element of entrenching his power base, which many people. So he's 4 years, he says, 4 years, I will be in power for 4 years only, and then we shall have elections. 4 years passed, there was no election. And then what does he say? Oh, you know, we need a new constitutional dispensation. We need to write a constitution. Yes, and then what happens? We went out, he establishes a constitutional commission. Before, he established a commission of inquiry into violation of human rights, up to his time. So they went around, found out what went wrong with Idi Amin, under Obote, under whatever. Okay. And he said, okay, this is very important. We need human rights. We need rule of law. We need constitutionalism. Let's write a constitution. Constitutional Commission is put in place. 4 years were spent consulting. I remember I am among those people who worked so hard, since I told you I've been in the trenches, to ensure that people participate. I even held a meeting for the Constituent Assembly. A constitution is put in place. It has some good safeguards. The whole world hails Uganda. Uganda is on the path to recovery. It's a path, it has a new constitution. A constitution that will bring and usher a new political dispensation. All of us are proud. I was there in the conference center when it was promulgated. The then chairman of the Constitutional Commission presents it to the president, and you could feel the aura of freedom. You could feel the hope. You could feel that Uganda was again back to recovery. But what happens shortly after? Come 1996, the first elections, and movement system of governance. Movement system of governance, what does that mean? Under one party state, we are going to have elections under his movement system of government. And what is that? It is based on individual merit, no competition. Ugandans look at the system as, wait a minute, is that what we are craving for? People, and if you read my paper, people went to court to challenge many of these actions. Now that culminated in what is called the Referendum Act. Referendum Act is put in place. Oh, in 2000, these past leaders are swines. They belong to the annals of history. They are whatever. Is that democracy? Is that human rights? What is that? So, in my paper, as I take you forward, the 2006 elections were contested. Besigye, as opposition leader, goes to court and says, look, these are no elections. you rig the elections, you don't follow the rules, the Electoral Commission is unilaterally appointed. So the Supreme Court says what? Oh, the field is not level. The field is not level. These elections could not have been really free and fair. They were not, the field was not level. We saw a lot of problems. The electoral law, the electoral management board had problems. The freedom of speech was not respected. But then what do they finally decide? They say, no, there are not enough grounds to nullify the election. What? Even after you have established that the terrain was not smooth and fair? In the interest of political stability, the courts ruled that they could not nullify the elections because they knew who the bull was in the house. After all, they also have safeguard their bread. Okay, 2006, 2011 elections, many of you know what happened. We had walk to work. 2016 elections, I led the domestic election observation. And I want to tell you, these are no elections in Africa. Look, all the proposals that had been made for reform by the very bodies were flouted. The police, the army was on the street. They took over the whole process. And what do you see? Beatings, harassment, flouting of the rules, and there came 2016 elections. Amama Mbabas, who was the part of the ruling system, goes to court and contests presidential election petition number 1 of 2016. These elections are not free and fair. You know, the rules have been flouted and so on. Again, you see a replica. And I saw that also in Kenya. When the court here ruled, I think in the previous election, that you know, we are emulating the jurisprudence of Uganda, so we cannot hold otherwise. But let me leave that. But here we are. Presidential election petition number 1 of 2016. What do they find again? The Supreme Court finds the recommendations that were made by the Supreme Court in 1996, in 2001, in 2006, were never implemented. Oh, the elections, when you look at them, the election management body did not do a good job. There was no freedom of expression. The right to organize was also undermined. Transmission of elections, I think, left a lot to be desired. But we, however, rule that these elections cannot be nullified. The elections remain. President Museveni remains in power for another term. Oh my God. I contested this. I issued 6 statements. I said categorically the elections were not free and fair. They did not reflect the will of the people. What do I receive? Warning from the Inspector General of Police. You are inciting violence. You are an enemy of the state. I said, enemy of the state. Why do we have a constitution that spells out all the rules and how we should do the job? Is this the constitutionalism we're talking about? Anyway, cut the long story short. When we look at the whole question of democracy in Uganda, I examine it finally under 3 major strands. I look at the right to organize, freedom of expression, association and assembly, and of course, whether people can participate. So in conclusion, what do I say? Moving forward, my understanding is 1, Uganda has never had a democratic tradition. There's no value system that can promote such an experiment. The institutions are very weak. The personal rule phenomena remains. And as such, it has bred corruption, nepotism, exclusion, and increasingly conflict. So until we adopt a system that allows the individual to come to the center, allows the individual's interests to be reflected, allows the individual to be supreme, allows the individual, as Professor Huntington and Fukuyama says in the end of history, that the right to stand up, speak up, and be heard, until such a right is respected, you can never have democracy. Until that happens, it will be very difficult to talk about democracy in Uganda. In Uganda, it's about who is in power. The winner takes it all. If you control the military, if you control the resources, if your tribe is the one in power, then everything is in your interest. Everyone speaks one voice. They all praise you. You are the Messiah. You are unfound. Oh my God. Until they realize that there's a problem at hand. So I want to agree with my brother, Professor Mutai, that time has come for us to advance the phenomena of constitutional democracy, but I call it participatory democracy. And until that happens, Africa cannot be free, Ugandans cannot be free, freedom of choice can never take center stage, and democracy becomes more of a big, big joke. I rest my case.
Values and practices, and cutting and pasting them and pretending that we are advancing a democracy in the region. I will not delve or step into the territory of Steve, who is going to lead us in the debate and the discussion around the two presentations. We are very grateful for both of you, Prof. Mutahi and Dr. Livingstone, for engaging us in a very lively first session presentations that should give us some really food for thought for the rest of the agenda. May I invite Steve? Steve, can you help us now to launch the debate? Kindly give us enough time so that we can have a really strong participation from the rest of us. Short of telling you to be brief, I'm just asking you to give us enough time to discuss. I think it will be better if you can go in front to the podium. Yeah. All those who are going to intervene. Okay.
5 minutes.
Yes.
It's fine. Yeah.
Since this is a live product, yeah. Actually the whole world, the whole earth is watching us. And our camera is right there on the podium. Can we have all the interveners going to the podium to express their views or give us their comments? Thank you. Steve, please, welcome.
Thank you very much. First, I must say that I'm very privileged to have been invited here. Thank you very much, Professor Mutai, for inviting me. And I'm also glad that my teacher, Professor Kagwanja, is here to see me justify why he was paid to teach me. And on matters of Uganda, I'm not one of those who call themselves experts. My relationship with Uganda is at 3 levels. First of all, I am trained as an anthropologist with a more recent bias in jurisprudence, and that links me to Okot PBTech. So my reading of Uganda is fairly based on the thinking and reflections of Okot PBTech. And secondly, like Dr. Livingstone rightly said, there's a lot of interfacing between the experiences of the various British colonial experiments. So there's a bit of important interplay here. And in the morning, we got the importation and the use of Mamdani, which a lot of people use and which he has also used a lot in his thinking. Now, I will make 5 observations in the paper, which I think is very well written, and then try and persuade him on a couple of issues that perhaps would support his excellent argument. One, I do think that there's a disclaimer he made which is very important and I want to emphasize. If we were to read the paper on page 4, the author says, the post-colonial period witnessed a serious democratic reversal as the civic space and newly found freedoms were eroded by post-independent government. And during his presentation, he deleted that part. So that matter is settled, because you rightly said that we cannot say there have been reversal of democratic gains because there was no democracy in the first place. So I'm sure you're going to go back to the paper and delete that part, because I agree with you that we can't talk of reversal because there was no democracy in the first place. So that, I think, is excellent consensus. So consensual democracy coming to play in the reading as well. The other part of the thought, as an anthropologist, we may want to negotiate a bit is, how do we deal with the pre-colonial situation? Do we deal with it as a repugnant moment, or do we deal with it as a moment that formulated peculiar democratic, political, and economic framings? That is something that we may want to negotiate as we talk about elasticity, because I think if you look at contemporary constitution of Uganda and of Kenya and South Africa and Ghana, which you also mentioned later on in your submission, you'll see us tend to return to some of the political, economic, and legal framings in pre-colonial times. And I want to suggest, therefore, that we may want to be careful in using words such as tribal kingdoms, words such as autocratic kingdoms, because if you were to read those systems contrapuntally, meaning in a counterpoint way, then one would see that those systems have had certain ingredients in terms of either political formation and organizing, economic models and legal models that have been imported in contemporary constitutions. And so one must therefore come back to the question, so what is repugnant, especially if you want to deal with the question of elasticity? That which is repugnant is not therefore necessarily that which is African and that which is pre-colonial. That which is repugnant, if you go back to again Mutai's question of consensus, may well be that which is alien and is imposed in a particular context without taking into account historical, cultural, and contextual, unfoldings. So repugnancy can no longer be said to be an African thing. And that is something that perhaps we need to negotiate, because that comes through in the paper, and it has its own implications. The last thing about the paper, which I liked a lot and I want to talk about, is the question of using liberal notions of human rights as a framework of narrating the post-colonial. And the liberal notions that the author has deployed very successfully are right to organize, we have the freedom of, the right to participate, we have freedom of information, and of course that comes along with the freedom to exercise free will and vote. we have a right to speech, and so on. Now, therein lies a potential problem again. Our colleague who from Canada has left shortly. But in his opening remarks, he raised something which was very useful, and which I think would be very useful in also your very good importation of Amartya Sen. If we looked at democracy within the realm of civil rights alone, then we lose something that is larger, which is the social economic rights. Because if people can go and vote, but then they go voting barefooted, if people go and vote and then they go and starve, then democracy has no meaning. And Amartya Sen's idea of democracy as freedom is about this other livelihood question. So I would suggest that in your criteria of analysis, we may want to move beyond civil rights in isolation and mingle them up and try and suggest that social economic rights as well, we're talking about education, we're talking about work, we're talking about freedom from want generally, are important ingredients also of measuring democracy. Now, a couple of issues around which I would like to convince you to take on board. One, my reading as a scholar of Uganda issues is unfortunately based on the works of, well, maybe not unfortunate, but fortunately based on the works of Mutebi, who is also in the House, and I actually told him that he should have been the discussant. Now, Mutebi has also done a very good historicization of the question of Uganda democracy and its current unfoldings. And Mutebi's work takes on board the role of the old kingdoms, Moso, Buganda, and Bunyoro kingdoms, and how those kingdoms have played out in the contemporary Uganda, and also how they played out in the formation of the colonial. So, he says, for example, when the British get into Uganda, their indirect rule in Uganda was based basically by taking on the Buganda kingdom and making them the agents. So there's a particular model of using the Buganda kingdom, because ultimately the Buganda became the agents of the British colonial administration. And that played out later on in terms of the kind of citizenship that unfolds in Uganda. So a hierarchy is built, a new hierarchy is built, and the Bugandas are up there, and so on. And then later on, how that plays out in interwars, especially between Bugandas and Bunyoro, and after independence, those unfinished wars, especially the 1907 wars, play up after independence. So it is therefore, in my opinion, that if you were to take the second part of the theme, which is the mosaic, it may be useful that the paper takes into account the reintroduction of the kingdoms and how that sort of has informed the way democracy is formulated and unfolded in Uganda. It may not be possible, in my opinion, to talk about the Uganda question incomplete without bringing out that role of the kingdoms and how that has been used opportunistically or realistically in the performance of democracy. The other thing that I think is useful, and again, Mutebi has always brought it out, is militarization of democracy. And Uganda is a perfect example. Ethiopia is learning on the same footings and so on. But this militarization of democracy is an important genre in the notion of elasticity that I think we may benefit from if you were to import it in this conversation. Two last points. It is not possible to talk about Uganda in particular from an endogenous conversation per se. You have to bring out external conversations that have also influenced what Uganda is today. For example, what happens in big Congo and small Congo affects Uganda. What happens in Sudan, South Sudan, affects Uganda. What has happened in Rwanda affects Uganda. So it's very important perhaps to bring back these external unfoldings and how these external unfoldings have sort of played a role in the production of the democratic genre in Uganda, the way we see it today, and in fact also in focusing to the future. We also saw in ICC the role of Uganda has been sort of quite at the center. I don't know whether it's also possible to do a bit of provisioning. I am, well, the only research I've done in Uganda has been in Gulu. So I'm a fan of understanding what's happening in Gulu. And I think there's a way the cultural movement and the civil war that was not necessarily that of one military group versus another, but the military, but most of the civil war that include this cultural revivalist movement seems to be useful in thinking the mosaic character of Uganda's democratic model. So it may be useful, in my opinion, to think through that as well. And finally, as I say it for now, I don't know what to think about the very reflections of my friend Okot Pibitek. Because if you look at Okot Pibitek in the Song of Lawino, he tries to illustrate how our contemporary idea of modernity is a mingle of the traditional, is a mingle of the so-called modern, and it produces something that is completely new and fresh. And Museveni, opportunistically, has been purporting to do that. He's been trying to produce this, what he calls a mingle of a Ugandan style of democracy. We know it is opportunistic, but there's something interesting to learn there, and that is part of the consensus Mutai was talking about. Because, and if I may give my last point on the Mutai's idea, which I agree with, is that, and it's not just an African question. We saw recently Singapore has gone the same way. Singapore has introduced the presidency as a way of creating a new consensual model of democracy, because the prime minister portfolio was going to a particular majoritarian in Sudan, was solved through secession. Here in Kenya, I think the secession politics is still ripe. There's a ceasefire now, but the secession politics is something that is there in the lips, and I can tell you it has not died. If one day there emerges a president in Uganda who is pro-Luo Nyanza, the likelihood of that politics coming back will be very, very high. And I'm a citizen of Luo Nyanza myself. If one day there's another kingpin in coastal Kenya who takes forward the Pwani Kenya debate with vigor and reason, then I think we will be seeing the mainland, hinterland problem that we're seeing between Zanzibar and Tanzania. So this secession question is a questioning of the state in terms of its borders, in terms of its inability to create a nation, and that, in my opinion, must come to play when we're talking about democracy in our current times. Thank you very much.
We are supposed to break now.
Thank you very much. I would like to raise 2 points. One is a general one about the discussion we've had this morning. The other one would be more directed at Dr. Sewanyana. The first one is that we keep referring to this notion of democracy and what it does and what it doesn't do, and where it is and where it isn't. What is it? When we say democracy, are we talking about the same thing? That there is something definite. We all agree democracy is this, it looks like this is how it works. And I would like to argue that if we agree that we all want democracy, all of us in this room want democracy, we must first of all agree what it is. What is that thing that we want? That's the general comment. The second one, if, for argument's sake, we were to say that we are talking about liberal democracy and free competition and all that, the question I would put to Dr. Sewanyana is a simple one. Can we have democracy? Can we have liberal democracy in a context where political parties don't exist? Political parties, as they should be, don't exist. Or where political parties are so weak as to be dysfunctional. And Uganda is a very good example. All our political parties, or so-called political parties, are riven with intense factionalization. There's not a single party leader in Uganda, maybe with the exception of Museveni, who is accepted by all purported members of that party. Every time we have elections within political parties, they fight as much among themselves about internal elections as we do about national elections. Then again also, there are no parties with members in Uganda. In the 60s and 50s, we used to have political parties with members who would have paid for membership. They had membership cards. They subscribed to their political parties. They paid membership fees. In Uganda, we don't have that anymore. There is hardly a political party that has a group of party supporters or members who buy cards and buy T-shirts and contribute money. On the contrary, people who purport to be members of political parties expect political parties to give them money. So actually, you cannot identify a coherent group of people whom you can say these are supporters of party X. So if we are talking of liberal democracy, and I'm assuming that's what you're talking about, can we have it in a context of that kind? Thanks.
Thank you, Prof.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for the very illuminative presentations. Professor Mutahi, I know there are quite a number of professors here. So Professor Mutahi, in your very convincing presentation, you conclude by asking or leading us towards this thing you're calling constitutional democracy. And you're talking about negotiation being between normative values, a minimum and a maximum. And the question that struck me is, and you are saying that it has to be within these values. So the question then becomes, how do you get these values? Why can't we just have the negotiations without any limits? What is the purpose of the limits, and how do we get these limits? Thank you.
It's very interesting. We have to work for even a single question. Well, I think I take the presentation by my brother Mutahi as a very, daring attempt to get at theorizing what is essentially described as a reversal, the democracy itself as a state of reversal in Africa. And I had that word contested by another bold statement that Africa has never had democracy and you can never reverse what was not there anyway. But I was sharing with Mutai and saying, I think we need to interrogate attempts, very, very serious attempts to bring democracy, not necessarily enabling it to gain roots and to see the practice of it, but basically the attempts by our people to bring the concept of democracy. First, the whole notion of nationalism in Africa was born on the wings of democratic thinking. It was democratic aspiration. That's what nationalism was all about. If you look at all the concepts, the concept that underpin African nationalism. And therefore, all states in Africa, modern states as we know them in Africa today, were born on the wings of democracy. No country, except possibly you can bring Angola, maybe, and Mozambique. Every other had a convention, a Lancaster House, where you bring all the voices, and they differed and disagreed, and they agreed on a constitution brokered by the colonial forces. You can talk about how democratic they were or they are not, but the underpinning of the constitutions were there. So the first decade of the 60s was basically the reversal of that democratic aspiration. Uganda, Kenya had Lancaster Conference, Zimbabwe has a Lancaster Conference, and so on. All those were there, and the debate was intensely democratic. At what point did we begin to reverse that democratic aspiration and process? Mutahi, on the concept of democracy, I think we have more or less debated Western model of democracy, and it is utopian as you put it. It is Athenian. The notion of Athenian democracy is only beginning to be realized with the coming of the internet, where there's so many opportunities where participation doesn't necessarily mean going to the Athena and debating. I think this is the debate about digital democracy. Digital democracy is about basically bringing to life the Athenian democracy. But the fundamental question is democracy a problem in Africa alone, or is a problem that is beginning to become universal? I was reading the current issue of Foreign Affairs, and it's a screaming title, Is Democracy Dying? That's the title of this month, And the issue is Trump a Democrat? Does America have democratic institutions? So again, the difference between the aspirations of the people and the practice. And from time to time, dictators will come and go, but if you have the culture of democracy, that's another matter. Do we have a culture of democracy in Africa? And in the notion of elasticity, I think this is really the most innovative part of this conference, and I think this is what attracted me here. The whole concept of how have we responded to the challenges to our democratic aspirations? I think that's the question. In 1960, we talked about the mass parties. The so-called one-party states were initially conceived not as instruments of dictatorship, but instruments of inclusion. Listen to Jomo Kenyatta in Parliament. My brothers have gone east and west, and the only thing innovation in our times in regard to democracy is mass party, where we don't have an opposition outside, we have opposition within. That was his argument in 1964-65. But then it degenerates into a monolithic political system. The aspiration is good. We want a democracy in which we can have constitutional kind of ideas within ourselves in one formation. It didn't work. That experiment didn't work. It aborted. Now we have power sharing, which my friend Steve talked about. The power sharing. Power sharing is another bold attempt to bring constitutional. And I worked for the power sharing system in Kenya. And what was difficult was that you have to fight and you have to agree. So whatever you do, you have to come up with a consensus, because how do you move forward without a consensus in that government? So I'll be attacking Raila Odinga in the newspaper, and I'll be calling him sir in the boardrooms, because we need consensus. Again, another experiment in constitutional democracy that failed. The new constitution, particularly in Kenya, and the new constitutional experiments in Uganda, the new constitutional experiment in Zimbabwe, the new constitutional experiment in Zambia, are all these attempts at constitutional arrangement. The new call for referendum in Kenya, for an inclusive constitution that go beyond the diarchy, that the rule of two tribes. What is that? Is that another attempt at constitutional? The question I'm asking Professor Mutahi is, in this concept of elasticity, how far can we look at it in terms of the values you say are underpinning it? Are these values also shifting? Or is this systems that are shifting? Thank you.
Thank you for the presenters. I have a comment and a question. As Dr. Livingston, I think, said, asking if we consider democracy as values, I think it is very important to describe what are those values, so that we can be able to assess how far our countries have gone in terms of adopting or implementing those values. So in that perspective, and considering that the idea is to propose policy options, I'm wondering how, if we consider democracy as a governance model, how can African countries build their democratic processes based on their experiences, including the situation before colonization? Because, and then considering also what is the final purpose? What is the final purpose of democracy, of what we call democracy? Otherwise, if we talk about having or not having democracy, we will end by saying we have or we don't have, but there is the risk to miss the key issues, because we know also that in Western countries, which are considered as democratic ones, experiences of democratization are not similar. There are some differences. So my question or my proposal is to see how can we build on experiences of our societies and countries to agree on a governance model which can ensure, in my view, the final purposes, which is to build peaceful societies and peaceful countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Yours was more of a challenge than a specific question. Very pertinent. It's a challenge for all of us now to answer that question. These values, do you think we need them to identify them so that we use those as a yardstick? That was Professor Kari and his links to the question that Professor Peter also asked. Link constitutional to the value. Okay. Yes, yes.
Thank you for the floor. To be comfortable, let me use French, since our translator are seemingly competent. Pour la démocratie, le problème, dans mon point de vue, pour la démocratie, c'est que, sans empiéter sur ce que je veux parler, sur ce que je veux dire sur le Burundi, c'est que on a la démocratie là où on n'en a pas besoin. Parce que, comme toutes les politiques publiques, où que ce soit, pour qu'il y ait pertinence d'une politique, de quelque chose d'innovant, il faut qu'il y ait un écart entre ce que l'on vit ou ce qui est, a gap with what we do. L'écart, le gap, le fossé entre ce que les gens vivent au quotidien, de ce qui est, et ce qu'on devrait ou ce que l'on pourrait vivre si les choses étaient orientées ou organisées autrement, et que cela soit partagé par la population dans son ensemble, du sommet à la base, voilà alors qu'il y aurait l'innovation. Alors, je reviens à la question. Alors, je pose la question à mon frère Moutaï, je pose la question aux différents intervenants. Est-ce que la démocratie, telle qu'on en a défini les normes, a-t-elle été introduite pour répondre aux besoins, à l'écart, tel qu'est vécu et exprimé par les bénéficiaires in fine? Voilà d'abord la première question. Et c'est là que mon frère de l'Ouganda, quand il parlait de la période pré-coloniale pour l'Ouganda, disait qu'il n'y avait pas de démocratie. Évidemment, là, pour moi, pour le cas du Burundi, je dirais que pour la tradition burundaise avant la colonisation, il y avait une sorte de démocratie et curieusement, c'était ressenti et vécu par les Burundais dans leur ensemble. Et pour cause d'ailleurs, le roi du Burundi a, à maintes reprises, été obligé de se soumettre à la décision des notables à la base, les notables Bashingantahi. On y reviendra s'il le faut sur le Burundi. Alors, pour revenir à la question relevée par Moutaï sur la démocratie consociationniste, mais là, le problème se pose. Je prends l'exemple du Burundi. Avec l'accord d'Arusha, l'accord pour la paix et la réconciliation Burundi signé à Arusha en 2008 pour mettre fin à la longue guerre civile, on a octroyé 60% pour les Hutus, 40% pour les Tutsis, au moins 30% pour les femmes. C'est ce qu'on a pensé à Arusha. Même si ce ne sont pas les Burundais à la base qui l'avaient demandé, mais quand même, le fait que ces institutions aient interagi avec la base, avec la population, ça avait quand même produit quelque chose de nouveau qui avait apaisé quand même les rancœurs ethniques. Vous voyez? Et pour moi, alors, c'est tout un débat à mettre. Est-ce que les institutions répondent aux besoins de la population, d'une part? Est-ce que les institutions bien pensées, même si elles ne sont pas demandées par la base, ne peuvent pas influencer et décanter les rancœurs et donc conjurer les conflits? Voilà ma question. Donc le débat, je le répète, est à voir où trouver l'innovation pour répondre aux questions que l'on a, aux challenges que l'on a, n'est-ce pas? Parce que manifestement, d'après ce que Moutaï et Jean et notre ami là, le think tank a pour rôle justement de s'imaginer, au regard des problèmes, des solutions susceptibles de produire l'innovation. Et je crois que c'est notre rôle ici. Merci.
My apologies for coming in late, but I did manage to catch on. I have some provocative thoughts that were going through my mind as I listened to the presenters and some of the questions that were posed here. And my questions really are, is democracy too abstract a concept for Africans? Is it fair to impose this abstract concept on Africans? I ask this because if you look at the countries that have progress similar to our own, like Singapore, they didn't put democracy first. They put the welfare of the people. What is democracy? Is it really about my freedom of expression, or is it about my welfare? And again, I ask the question, can I think if I'm hungry or my stomach is empty? And if indeed consociational democracy is the way to go, then if you look at a country like Kenya, where we can say that the county systems were a sort of consociational democracy with 47 semi-autonomous, really, political entities, then why is it so important who becomes the president of the Republic of Kenya? So, on the other hand, the next question is about the militarization of democracy. It's not something that is peculiar to this country. America was militarized. They went to a civil war. They ended up losing more Americans in that civil war than they have lost to date in all their wars. Again, it's a controversy, and I don't wish this upon any African country, but is that perhaps the way to sort things out eventually? Because they don't have what you call a consociational democracy. They basically thrashed it out, for lack of a better word. So these are the sorts of things that were going through my mind, and I hope that over the next 2 days we'll be able to discuss the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for reminding us that democracy is just too tough a concept for us to fathom, hence our fumbling with it. And that may be that solution, the Napoleonian solution, when he created France and wanted also to extend the boundaries, is probably the ultimate. Subdue, go through a process that results in an ultimate domination. But the question is, will that domination be a domination, or is it the values that will win over other factors like identity and so on? So those are some of the challenges that your question also brings as a subset to that. Good. I would like to invite the experts to briefly respond. Each expert will give you 2.25 minutes. Then we give the floor to Carlos. Sorry, Carlos, but you'll find an audience that is still very much enthusiastic. Professor Mutai.
Thank you very much. Good comments. I really appreciate all of them. In fact, some of the questions, like the question Jennifer is asking, is a question I've grappled with lately from a book I'm reading, The Bad Samaritans. This book is a story of South Korea and how South Korea was exactly where Kenya was in the 1960s. In fact, the writer, who is a professor of political science or economics, I think, somewhere in Europe, he is my age, and he describes his house exactly the way my house used to look like when I was growing up. My mother had a refrigerator, and all neighbors used to bring their meat to be refrigerated in our place. When she bought a television, all neighbors used to come to watch news at our house. But now South Korea is way ahead. But what happened is they did a number of things. One, they ignored the advice of the Bretton Woods institutions. Sewanyana. They ignored the advice. And actually, the argument was that the Bretton Woods institutions, in particular IMF, World Bank, and WTO, were the bad Samaritans, that they were an unholy alliance. That's the first thing they did. The second thing they did is that they kicked democracy out the window. In fact, a man called General Pickens, I believe, who was the president there, basically drove the country into progress through means that were a little rough. Some human rights were both violated and abused, but they reached where they were going. Which brings me to the question Professor Ntamba has asked, and I think Pamphile asked the same thing, of what use is democracy to Africans or to man? And the question there is, I like the way you put it, do we need it? Who said we need it? And in my view, if it doesn't work for you, maybe it is not necessary. And if it doesn't work for you, you are better off making it malleable in a way that it fits your needs. And I'm saying this because Dr. Sewanyana, you said that consociational democracy, you view it as participatory democracy, but I see them as completely different. Reason being that one is about participation, the other one is about inclusion. The case of Kenya, and Dr. Steve Omar has said this, in Kenya, in the last election we had, 6.7 million people participated in the election on the side of Raila Odinga. 8.2 participated on the other side. But the 6.7 who were involved in participatory democracy were not included. Now this inclusion is what I'm saying we need to resolve it. Mauritius has a very interesting system. They call it the best loser system, where the best loser is brought into government and they are part of the constellation. I think inclusion is more the thing I was talking about. But Steve, you also talked about, and I agree with this point, and I think it was also mentioned by Mutabi, the whole idea of the traditional systems. And you also mentioned it, that actually the kingdom and the king in Burundi paid some courtesy to advisors. He was beholden, in a sense, to a council of people. And Steve, you are talking about the idea of demonizing the ethno-customary systems, which is, Sewanyana has gone in that direction, and I think the point is that there was some ethno-customary notions of African governance that we have let go, that if we can include into our models of democracy, we probably will better it. But now I'll answer two more questions. Barno, you asked the question about, but before I go there, you talked about secession. And I agree with you 100% that if we do not deal with the problem of exclusion and ethnic majoritarianism, and ethnic majoritarianism is produced by a participatory democracy. If we don't deal with that, secession will almost become inevitable in this part of the world. But now, Tubano, you asked about the normative, and I think Professor Kagwanja asked the same thing about the normative values and how they are determined. I am persuaded that constitution making is about two things. One is about process. is a process of negotiating values, is a process of negotiating an understanding of that which is good for a country. And two, constitution making is about, it's an act. The act is after you have done the negotiation, how do you codify it into a document that you refer to? Now, the Talcott Parsons, one of the sociologists I really like, describes that conversation that happened before you wrote the Constitution. He describes it as a non-contractual elements of contract. It is a non-contractual order. It is non-contractual in the sense that it is important for contract to happen, yet it has not been written into contract. Now that non-contractual order is a basket of values that are normative, and is that particular basket that you borrow from to create the boundary conditions I spoke about, the bare minimums normatively and the bare maximums. And I think that that also responds to Professor Kawanja's question regarding how do you deal with this. Because you ask whether the values are dynamic or whether they are static. And I'm persuaded that the non-contractual order is actually an order in motion. It is a process of constant negotiation and renegotiation. So the values keep on changing. But when you have a constitution that is rigid and the values change, then you're not able to accommodate the changes. And I think that's a problem we have in Kenya and the secession debate. We have said, why don't we expand the executive? Now that there is a handshake between former prime minister and the president, why don't you make him non-executive prime minister like you have in Rwanda, you have in Burundi, you have it in DR Congo, you have it in Uganda. And if you do so, you create inclusion of the 6.7 million people that voted for him. So my thinking on this is that so long as a non-contractual order does not inform the contractual order, the rigidity of our constitutions, which should be revised constantly, will lead to situations like the separation that Dr. Uma spoke about. Prof, that's exactly 2 minutes and quarter seconds.
Actually, it was 2 minutes and 56 seconds. Thank you very much, Prof. Mutai. Yeah, we still have to respond to the fundamental question here: what are those values? And if we insist, and if you are saying that values are dynamic or they are static, do we need to even define what do we understand by value before we even identify those values? So we might even at one stage engage deeper into thinking along those lines. So next, can we have Livingstone? Please, 2 and a quarter. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I may not do as well as my brother Mutahi, but my starting point will be that whatever model you are thinking about, definitely those two elements are important: participation and inclusion. And whatever model you interrogate, if those elements are actually absent, then I find it difficult to accept that such a model is democratic. That's one. Two, what is it? Many people are asking, what is this democracy thing, and do we need it? In my humble opinion, what it is, it's a value system that allows political equality and upholds human dignity. So it goes to this saying that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And what does that mean? A system that allows people to realize their potential, irrespective of their standing in life, in my view, is a system we are looking for. It is based on freedom, it's based on choice, it's based on understanding one another. Jennifer, you say, yes, some people did not need it, or maybe they used a different approach in the Asian countries. Of course, what we saw are liberty trade-offs there. But for it to succeed, if you are to read my book, if you refer to my paper, I have interrogated all these aspects in my paper, Comparative Experiences of NGO Frameworks in Eastern and Southern Africa. I make reference to it, published last year. You will find that there are certain conditions that must be in place for it to be realized. And definitely, you must avoid hunger, cannot be a good condition for it to be realized. Exclusion cannot be a good condition for it to be realized. But certainly, it's not limited to political expression, the way we seem to understand it. And I think it goes back to my brother there. If you read that book, you'll find that even in the industrialized world, there are certain conditions that had to obtain for it to happen. And I interrogate those at great length. My brother Glover says, where you don't really have parties, they don't have members, they don't have one. Can you really have it? Definitely, I would say no. Our parties don't even have ideology to talk about. They don't even have an ideology, whether they are center-right or left or what. They are just parties. Sometimes you wonder what they stand for. There must be a certain value, a certain thing you stand for. And sometimes I don't see that. Professor Kagwanja, you said Kagwanja?
Kagwanja.
Excuse me if I don't make a good case for your arguments. You say that we had democratic experiments, or you even talk about democratic aspirations. You even talk about democratic thinking. My fundamental question to you, brother, professor, is a dream. Can a dream be reversed? If you have ever dreamed, can you reverse a dream? That was the dream that the people had. But it was not realized in practice. In my analysis, even, you see, they had a dream to be free. Like Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream that America shall be free. Did these people, the Africans, they had a dream? Yes. But did they ever realize it? You look at the behavior of these people. All these presidents you talk about, the Kenyattas, the Nyereres, and so on. To what extent did they actually realize that dream? Other than power. They really had power. Here in Kenya, you talk about the land question. Who is responsible for that land question? I hear people talk about certain people have so much land that the others have become landless. Who are the origins of this? Are they the leaders? If you go back to all these leaders, you'll be shocked by what you find. So my brother in Burundi, who says that the Arusha and that the king of Burundi allowed some degree of expression and negotiation, but you were I loved your observation that he consulted the notables. So when you talk about the notables, does that also include the rank and file? Already there is exclusion. You definitely, and that's what I said, that if you look at all these kingdoms, whoever is making a case for that these kingdoms were democratic, these kingdoms were stratified. The society was stratified. And like India, sometimes you are born into a particular class and you die in that class. And I see the same phenomena almost in ours. I have difficulty, my brother Mutahi, to see those practices that one can say ethno-customary, you say, were really democratic. What are those? You know, kneeling down, you know, subjecting people to fire, you know, the so-called consultation which we talk about, I have difficulty with it. I have difficulty finding those practices which you say really were consultative and they allowed the voice of the common person in the final decision making. They're always difficult. But the point is this, at the end of it all, do you really need it? In my very, very humble opinion, I would say we need it. Because, of course, as if you go back to history, Rousseau and Montesquieu and so on, all those philosophies, they all talk about the fact that, you know, initially people used to come together in open spaces, they would have their voices heard, but as society became complex, there was a need for a system of governance that allows that representation. So if you are going to have leadership, you definitely need a structure or a process or a mechanism that allows everyone's voice to be heard. Of course, if I go to Russia, I have been to the Red Square. When I interrogated the practices there, they also say they are democratic. Communism, they say, was democratic. Socialism was democratic. Everyone says my system is, even the military, back home, they say they are very democratic. Actually, the president the other day, while addressing the State of the Nation, he said he has never seen any democratic country like Uganda. It's the most democratic, he said. But when you look at his leadership style and what he does, one wonders. I still think, the last second, I still think that we need to evolve a system where even the poorest of the poor, the humblest of the humblest, can also feel some sense of belonging, that I belong to the Republic of Kenya and I'm proud of it. That very essence, I've told people that when I fly into Washington, something that strikes me is that freedom. I feel free. And many people have told me the same. When I fly into Nairobi, when I fly into Kinshasa, when I fly into whichever country and capital, do I feel that sense of freedom? I want to hear, I want to feel, in Addis Ababa, my sister, do I feel that among the Oromos and the others? Do I feel that in Rwanda, in Burundi, the Tutsi and the Hutu, in Rwanda, do they really feel that sense of belonging? That the little they have, they can actually make the best use of it. That the day when that happens, that is the day I will say we have democracy.
Thank you for that conclusion. Very interesting. You know, as we continue the debate, let us remember the context. The context, the region, the majority of the population are rural-based. They are either peasants or nomads, and most of these people are illiterate or at best semi-literate. And our debate here is amongst the elite, and what we are addressing is an elite problem, democracy. And there are certain questions, of course, that arise in all the presentations and interventions. The issue of participation, the issue of inclusion. But then somebody asked a very fundamental question, and that is democracy a felt need? Is it a felt need? Is it a priority? In the context, we are contextualizing. We are not denying the fact that it's a universal value. It's accepted. but then the context. Which brings me to Lenin and his attitude towards the peasants. The peasants and the workers, those with a higher conscience and those who live very close to the nature and whose livelihood is strictly linked to the vagaries of that nature, and therefore whose priorities are totally different, and even their cosmological worldview belongs elsewhere. This is the context of our debate. So the question is, if we talk about these values and principles, and we say that we have no history of democratic practice, we have no democratic culture, and you bring in the term culture into it, culture has a connotation. It's something you live, you identify with. It is something you can actually express yourself in your mother tongue. It is something that can actually come out of your soul, the culture. And yet we are talking about democracy, democratic practice. Can the peasant or the nomad identify himself or herself with the concept of democracy in the mother tongue and in the context? So the debate that we are launching here, I think, is critical, is important. And the paradigm shift here should be manifest. I liked it when Peter Kagwanja said that the elasticity element in it is what attracted him most. So I want to encourage all of us not to think out of the box, but to think without it, to quote my good friend, Professor Mutai. Let us think without the box. And come up with what can be linked to deep thinking and praxis, so that whatever results will come out with here during our discussions, something that can be understood and digested at all levels, not just at the elite level. Because in the final analysis, it is the elite that end up defining the parameters of democratic practice, and not those peasants. They're only involved in participation. I think the debate captured it very well. They participate, but more often than not, they participate at a level of understanding which is not the same level of understanding as those who actually encourage them or incite them to participate. And neither do they participate at the level of what the scholars, thinkers, would like it to be in terms of the ideal. So on that note, I would like to congratulate our presenters this morning. We've had a very exciting couple of sessions, from the introduction to the actual work itself. I would like to invite the whole floor to give a huge clap to our presenters. To our discussants,